My guest is Israel Pupko. He's from Mexico. Welcome to the show, Israel.
Thank you very much.
You migrated, made Aliyah to Israel. When did you do that?
In 1991.
And why? Were you planning all your life to be an Israeli? Or?
Well, basically I was brought up in a Zionist Jewish environment, family school, youth movement.
This is in Mexico City?
In Mexico City, yeah. So after high school, I moved to Israel, first to study, and then I decided to stay.
And did you study, because you now are finishing a thesis on Jewish identity, really?
Yeah, I finished at Hebrew University a BA on sociology and Jewish history, and then I continued at the Institute for Contemporary Jewry, studying migration. And then I continued my PhD at the Hebrew University.
Is there a big Mexican migration, or from Latin America to Israel?
From Argentina and Uruguay, mostly. From all other Latin American countries, it's rather marginal.
I see. And what's the sort of, do they come to Israel and have a different position, say, than American migrants or Russians? What's their situation in Israel?
Well, it is a little bit different. Some scholars call it an invisible community. Mostly they don't build immigrant organizations, and they pretty much integrate in the general population.
I see.
So they're probably a little bit less visible than other migrant populations.
But do they have similar difficulties? Do they go back and forth? Are they part of the diaspora? Like American Jews go back and forth, or Canadian Jews?
Well, basically, it's hard to make generalizations, but I guess some of them visit their families and go back and forth. Transnational migrants are mainly from other places, European and North American, although some Russians also live transnational lives in Israel.
But Mexicans don't?
No.
I see.
No.
And is it because of their business relationships? Because your research is really on the transnational migrants.
True. Basically, well, there's a very, very small Mexican migration to Israel, but North Americans and Europeans do manage business or businesses or professions in their former countries of immigration. So they travel once a week. Some of them travel once a month, or spend a few months here and a few months there, and they live in both countries.
Because part of the nature of the new globalized world, anywhere, I mean any country, it's not just Israel, and Israel is very much in the globalized culture, is to live in more than one place for a lot of people. I mean, I did, and I know lots of other people who are in this. They're nomads again. You got the new nomadism, if you want. Mm-hmm. And that's true of Israelis. And what does that do to the Israeli identity as more and more people, instead of ingathering, they're going out and coming in and they're doing everything?
Well, I don't think that one comes instead of the other. You can be in both places and identified completely with those places. You don't necessarily have to be in one place. I mean, even if you don't move, you can theoretically not identify with the place. In the other side, you can move. You can be an hypermobile immigrant and still pretty much identified with Israel. These immigrants do identify pretty much with Israel. Actually, most of North Americans, transnational immigrants who I research, they tend to feel more attached to Israel than their former countries. But it's like loving your mom and your dad. You can love both, and the love for one doesn't come instead of the other. So they develop multiple identities and get deeply involved in both places.
And what happens to their children?
Children, well, the most common scenario.
If they're, of course, if they're raised in Israel, that's not the problem. But what if they're raised abroad? I mean, you have all the Israelis in Toronto or New York and Los Angeles.
The most common scenario of transnational, of North American transnational immigrants to Israel is the scenario of transnational Hong Kong immigrants in Vancouver, for example. Meaning that both spouses and children move to Israel, and then one of the spouses, most generally, the male spouse, travels back and forth to either Canada or the US or other places to continue working in those places, while the non-commuting spouse or the mother stays with the children in Israel. Most likely they go to school in Israel, and they...
That's no different, but what if the reverse happened?
The reverse almost is not happening, at least not in the sample that of immigrants that I interviewed. Only one case, the mother and the children were in the U.S. while the father commutes to Israel to work.
I see.
So more often than not, the mother stays with the children in Israel while the father works abroad.
What's the effect, do you think, on the Israeli identity as a whole, quite aside from the individual family?
Well, it's a very interesting subject for Israel, because the country as a whole hasn't defined its borders yet, and this phenomenon is actually challenging the concept of border, the concept of place, of home, of community. And the question is whether you can be part of a community without exactly being there. In Israel, yet there's a quite an emphasis put in the concept of land, of territory. So many of these individuals that come and go are not positively seen by general society or the media. They criticize transnationalism, like just as transnationalism is criticized in some other places. So policymakers, planners, thinkers, shapers of public opinion don't always perceive transnationalism as a positive factor. Actually, that is one of the challenges, that Israel as an absorbing country has to review its immigration policies in order to cope with transnational migration.
Yeah, because it has to adopt. It's going to be part of the globalized world, and it's going to increase, not decrease, I assume.
Exactly. And in the same way, Israel is not yet coping perfectly fine with its expatriates abroad.
Is there any thought in Israel of having Israeli schools abroad? Where you have all these Israelis, why not have an Israeli school in New York or Los Angeles or wherever?
Not yet. We actually just started an NGO dealing with this issue and wanting to actually challenge previous conceptions in which the state of Israel didn't do enough in order to maintain a link with its expatriates abroad. Not as France or Italy, which invest pretty nice amounts of money in building schools and organizations. Israel hasn't invested yet.
Do you think it's coming?
Well, hopefully one day Israel will develop.
When you say hopefully, it means it's not very soon.
not very soon. Hopefully, well, so far Israel thought that if these expatriates weren't well organized, most likely they were going to go back to Israel, to return to Israel to live. There are about 1 million, 3/4 to 1 million of Israelis living abroad. Most likely in the nearest future, most of them, in the best case scenario, won't go back to Israel to live. And therefore, it is imperative for Israel to develop an fundamental, positive, deep relationship to its expatriates.
With that, we have to end. Thank you very much, Israel, for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.